Hello, everybody. Today we are going to talk about creating weapons, armor, gear, items, consumables, stuff. Specifically, material stuff and equipment, things like that for Daggerheart. This is a topic that I had been asked to like take a swing at several months ago, probably early in the summer, not long after the game came out. I got the first kind of request to take a look at that, and I hadn't right. I had it on my list of ideas to draw from, and just had not been inspired to give it a shot until earlier this week. Some of the stuff that I was doing on other projects, and also some reflecting on these cool items from Many Worlds Tavern. I think I talked about them earlier. They have started doing Daggerheart compatible material. If you don't know Many Worlds Tavern, they are a like a coffee and tea company. They have a subscription service, but they do lots of like fantasy themed stuff. And so they had been doing 5e compatible, items and spells and things like that. And they've expanded into also creating some things along those lines that are Daggerheart compatible. And I got to talk with some of the folks who run Many Worlds Tavern at PAX Unplugged, and that's how I got some of these cards. And I was really taken both by the art and by how much fun it seems like it must be to design these things. And so that gave me a bit of inspiration for today's stream. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to talk about my kind of personal guiding principles for creating armor and weapons, and then also talking some about like other items, whether that's gear or consumables. This is not an aspect of Daggerheart compatible design that I tend to focus on, but I do think that I have some thoughts, and it'll be fun to use having a stream as an excuse to kind of poke my brain and try to make some things happen. And we'll see where we go. So, as a reminder, with any of our streams we're doing homebrewing or design, we are using the Darrington Press Daggerheart community gaming license. Sorry, stumbled over that a little bit. Right, as we can see here with the cool potion bottle, this is not an official stream. I do not speak for anybody at Darrington Press or Critical Role on this, just for my own self, my own personal thoughts about the game. I worked on it, but I'm only going to speak for myself in talking about it. So, all of that said, we can go in here. Behold my extensive notes. Sometimes, like, when I GM Daggerheart, I tend to have more notes than this, but there's a joke that like an improv DM will like that this is the amount of notes that they would bring to a game. So I thought that was a funny bit. What we're going to do is on my other tab, I'm going to go over to the SRD, and I'm going to zip over to the weapon tables, because we're going to talk about weapons, armor, and then other gear and items. Because I think I may have the most to say about weapons and armor, because it ties into a lot of other mechanical elements of the game, whereas consumables and items, they can do any number of things because of like categorization. Weapons and armor more directly tie into the combat and damage systems and things like that. So, key elements when designing weapons. Damage pools and range tend to be inversely related. And what that means is, if your weapon has a range of melee, it is more likely to have a higher damage die and a higher damage pool in general. If your weapon has a range of close, it will probably have a little bit less damage. If your weapon has a range of far or very far, you're probably going to be on the lower end of your damage dice and your damage pools. We can see that in the examples from the SRD itself. It's in the core book, but I'm looking at the SRD here. So if we go to the Warhammer, which is a strength melee weapon, at tier 1 we can see that it is a d12 plus 3 physical damage, two-handed weapon, and it has the heavy feature, which gives you a -1 penalty to evasion, right? That's kind of the top end of damage, limited range, and then it has a negative feature because that damage die is so big, right? It's D12 plus 3 at tier 1. It's the largest damage pool of any tier 1 weapon that is in the SRD. Now, there are other melee weapons that have a D10 die pool, right? Greatsword is D10 plus 3, and it has Massive. Massive gives a -1 to evasion, but also it gives effectively Powerful, where on a successful attack, you roll an extra damage die and discard the lower result, right? That Massive feature for Greatsword is both a positive and a negative. So as we're looking at the weapons in the SRD, we can start to identify where some of these trade-offs are happening so that we can design with that core structure in mind, even if we are not directly following it, right? You may decide that you want weapons that are a little bit more powerful than the kind of default or the average for whatever tier that you're designing them for, because that's what you want from your game, or because you're trying to create something that's intentionally more desirable, or maybe you create something that has below average stats for the tier so that you can then give it an incredibly powerful feature, right? These are levers in different settings that you can use so that the gear that you create feels like it is designed in a way that is consistent with how things are designed in core. If you want to break from this structure, that's fine, right? Especially if you're homebrewing just for your own table. I think if you're designing for publication, it may be a good idea to keep the range of what exists in core in mind a little bit more closely, because if what you create is notably outside those bounds and it's not flagged as being such, people who are just picking up a bunch of community content, right, third-party material, might get your work and others and then try to bring it to the table, and people involved may not understand or may not know that some of the design choices for individual items are a little bit more out of step with the balancing philosophy that is baked into how the core items are designed. Just to kind of round out this part of the discussion here, right? If we look at the longbow under tier 1 weapons, right? This is an agility weapon with a range of very far, so that's the farthest range. It is a type is very small. I'm going to make it bigger. It's a D8 plus 3. So that's not the smallest damage die that we see on weapons, right? We sometimes see a D4 for secondary weapons, especially like shields. So a D8 is not bad, right? It's not a D8, a D10 or a D12, which are the highest damage dice for most weapons, even though it has this very far range. But what it does have is the feature Cumbersome, which is a -1 to your finesse trait. Giving a penalty to a trait is, for me, in most cases, a bigger downside than giving a penalty to evasion, right? Evasion is not a trait that is rolled. It is a statistic that is rolled against by adversaries. But your finesse trait, your player character is going to be using to roll for any number of situations and circumstances. And so if you're lugging around a longbow and you have this penalty to finesse because it's harder to be more precise because you've got this kind of heavy, bulky thing, that's a bigger downside. So there's different magnitudes of positive and negative features. Some features are mixed, where they have a positive and a negative element. In the core book, items tend to have one feature, and so sometimes that feature is mixed with an upside and a downside. I don't think there's anything in how Daggerheart is designed that says you cannot give an item more than one feature, but Daggerheart does say to streamline and then streamline again. And so if you're designing items that have 2, 3, 4 features, that may become a lot more mental overhead, right? It increases cognitive load. And that's not necessarily just simplified or addressed by making a feature that is all three of those things combined. It may be advisable to think about the most condensed, most straightforward way of presenting whatever your mixed bag is. And I think if you're designing like legendary, epic, artifact level items, it's probably more appropriate to give them a couple of different features. And you can probably feel more comfortable doing that without feeling like you are out of bounds with the way that Daggerheart Core is designed, right? If you were playing in a Exandria game of Daggerheart and you were homebrewing the Vestiges of Divergence, I think it's reasonable to think that those vestiges might have multiple features, right? If you're looking at the 5e editions, you go, oh, well, does this weapon evolve like the vestiges do? How do you want to do that? Is that multiple features? There's a few different ways of doing it, right? It could scale with tier or something else. So I'm trying to flag where I feel like the rough boundaries are and talk about how intentionality and understanding the context of what the different numbers and how they relate to each other and what that can mean, so that you go into this process making deliberate choices rather than making choices based on assumptions that haven't been contextualized with the rest of how the design operates. So if we look at, right, we have physical weapons and magic weapons for each tier. The arcane gauntlets, the magic weapons that are strength melee, are d10 plus 3 magic damage, two-handed. If we go up to physical, right, the battle axe is strength melee d10 plus 3 physical. The greatsword is the same damage, but then it has that massive feature that has an upside and a downside, whereas the arcane gauntlets do not have a feature. If we go over to something like the glowing rings, which are an agility very close weapon, they deal a pretty good d10 plus 1 magic damage, two-handed, but no feature, right? They have a range beyond melee, so they probably shouldn't have as good of damage as a melee weapon, but it's still pretty good because that very close range is quite limited compared to the scepter, which has a range of far, or the wand, which has a range of far. And so we have that, more range tends to be less damage, and we see a lot of different spots along that scale, and we see how features can counterbalance being a little bit higher or a little bit lower on that scale. Like, oh, this is low damage for the range that it has, but then it has this positive feature. If we look over at the Great Staff, it has a range of very far, so it's the highest range you can have, but the damage is only a d6 magic damage, and it's two-handed, but it has the feature Powerful, where on a successful attack you roll an additional damage die and discard the lowest. So you're doing a smaller damage die, but you're more likely to get a higher result on the damage dice that you do roll because of that feature. When we look at tier 2 and above, we start seeing, some weirder, or what we might think of in other games as like, oh, these are magic items, right? Or special weapons. They're not just improved this, improved that. And so for this, I'm thinking about stuff like the bladed whip, the steel forged halberd, a blunderbuss. For me, a lot of the stuff at tier 2 could still be mundane. It's just a little bit weirder and or more specialized, right? A special type of halberd, a blunderbuss. A fine hair bow might be just high quality, or it might be a magic bow. And some of those other weapons at the tier are going to start giving us more divergence, especially in terms of features, right? If we look from Gilded Falchion through Fine Hair Bow, all of those tier 2 physical weapons have a feature of some sort. Pathfinder PhD says, so yeah, a spiked chain might be D8 damage with or without positive or negative features. Perhaps it could trip as a bonus ability, but be grappled by an adversary. Right. So the closest comparison for me is the bladed whip from the SRD, which I'm going to copy in here, just so it's easier for us to follow if you don't have the SRD open yourself. So that's an agility very close weapon, a D8 plus 3, because this is a tier 2 weapon. It's only one-handed, but it has quick. When you make an attack, you can mark a stress to target another creature within range as well, right? And so you're whipping this bladed, you're swinging this bladed whip around, and so you could hit multiple people. But if the spiked chain, if the kind of fantasy you're trying to design for is that tripping or grappling element, then you're probably looking at a different feature, right? So you might look at, you might give that weapon the trip feature that says on a successful attack, the target has to make a reaction roll 12 or be knocked prone and become vulnerable until they next take the spotlight. Right? That's a version of a tripping type of feature that's really all upside. The downside might be you have disadvantage on attacks against targets within melee range, right? It's this like spiked chain that's meant to be used at that very close range and is more awkward when you're in melee. Now, because we have ranged weapons like the bows and other things that don't suffer a penalty in melee, you might also just skip that part because these other weapons are not being given that mechanical penalty to express a similar fictional situation. But I think there's definitely space within the design to emphasize how awkward a weapon is when you're using it up close, and you give a particular weapon that kind of a penalty, even if you're not giving it, or other weapons that might be similar fictionally don't have it, just because we're choosing to emphasize that aspect as a trade-off that this weapon has. Pardon me while I take a drink. Okay. So looking at a few of the features that your weapons can have here, right? Brutal. When you roll the maximum value on a damage die, roll an additional damage die, right? And so that gets more powerful as your proficiency goes up because you're rolling more dice. You have more chances to roll that highest damage die. But also, the bigger your damage die, the lower the likelihood you're going to roll the highest value. So if you give a D6 weapon the powerful feature, that feature is more likely to activate than if you give it to a D10 damage pool weapon, assuming that the player characters are rolling the same number of proficiency dice. The exact statistics on that are a little bit more, like that's specificity I'm not going to go into this point. But the thing that I want to focus on is this idea that the same feature can be more or less useful on different items based on other aspects of that item's design. If you had a feature that says when you roll a 1 on a damage die for this weapon, you can re-roll it. Well, that's way more useful on a weapon that deals D6 damage than on a weapon that deals D12 from the perspective of how often you're going to get to do that. But when you do get to re-roll a 1 on a D12, your results are likely to trend toward the mean because your average roll on a D12 is going to be a 6 or a 7. So there's like an upside downside aspect of that. And these are all just the ways that some of the core math of the range of possibility that Daggerheart has are going to come into play with your design. Pathfinder PhD says, right, giving an item a narrative consequence is one of any number of ways that you can balance or intentionally design an item, right? There's a magic weapon at tier 2, the Ego Blade, right? Pompous. You must have a presence of 0 or lower to use this weapon, right? That is a downside in the form of a limitation, but it's also hugely characterizing, right? This idea that this is a weapon that only works if you are pompous, right? Not your presence score has to be 0 or lower. So your ego is big, but your ability to influence people is low because, and this, this is an interpretation, right? Is that the weapon connects with or resonates with the fact that a character is pompous. And a key thing with item and gear design for me is that reflavoring is always on the table. And it can be really useful to keep that in mind for items and gear, because the weapon and armor list is not super exhaustive compared to some other RPGs, especially RPGs that have a more like simulation focused, a more simulation focused design approach, where it is important that there be differentiations between these 3 different types of guns made by different companies in different countries. In your game of Daggerheart, there might be important differences between magic guns made by 3 different companies in 3 different countries. But the Daggerheart core book does not have that many guns. So if you want to bring in that complexity, you're encouraged to kind of do it yourself, or take what exists and then frame it, reflavor it into the structure that you need so that you have the variation and the detail that you need. For the Bastion of Hope campaign frame that I made and is in layout, I made some new weapons, right? I have a wand pistol and a rod rifle. The idea being like you take a magic wand and then you attach it to a handle and then it behaves kind of like a gun. And then a rod kind of replaces the barrel of a gun, right? A magic rod, right? Like a spinning baton kind of thing. And then it has the stock that you would use like a rifle. I added those to the campaign frame as part of the way that the frame says, hey, this is not just a late medieval fantasy setting. There are guns in this, but also these guns are different, right? It's not pistol and shotgun. It's wand, pistol, and rod rifle, right? We're doing magitech that's kind of coming from the magic world toward tech, versus like a magitech that's really high tech but with magic flavoring, right? For me, magitech can kind of go from at least 2 different directions. I just started playing last night Final Fantasy 13, which in what I've seen so far is very much magitech that starts from a base of a more science fiction-y aesthetic, as opposed to something like Final Fantasy 6, which for me is magitech that starts from a more fantasy aesthetic. Final Fantasy VII, I would also say, starts more science fiction, but part of that is also just the fact that you start in Midgard, which is a very kind of dystopian science fiction-y setting. Okay, so that's some stuff on weapons. A couple of quick notes. There are weapons that have a d20 dice pool in the core book. They are exceptionally rare. The one that I can think of, I'm trying to find it now, is makes you mark a stress every time you attack with it, right? And so you can have, it's like the Ruin Blade or something. It's very cool. If I search for Ruin, how long will it take me to find this? Is it even actually the thing? No, that's not the term. I am misremembering. Okay, so we're going back here. Notably, secondary weapons, right, should pretty much always be one-handed weapons, because they are secondary, right? You can't wield a secondary weapon as your primary weapon in rules as written, if I'm remembering correctly. Secondary weapons are usually, I want an offhand weapon that has range, or I want an offhand weapon that is better up close. I want an offhand weapon that I can use to dual wield, where I add a bonus to my damage of the primary weapon, because Daggerheart doesn't do dual wielding as making separate attacks, because that would kind of interact with the hope and fear economy in a way that for me doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. And then your secondary weapons include shields, which are going to increase your armor score. And we'll talk about armor more next. Notably, up at those higher tiers for secondary weapons, you still can also get cool weird stuff like Primer Shard. This is a very close weapon that deals D4 damage with instinct, and it's one-handed, but the feature says, locked on a successful attack, your next attack against the same target with your primary weapon automatically succeeds, right? So you use the Primer Shard, lock on, and then you can hit with something else. So if your character has like a primary weapon that uses a trait they're not as good at, or a weapon that maybe has a penalty to attack for some reason, but you have that Primer Shard, you lock on and then you hammer. The downside there with the Primer Shard is that it has low damage on its own, and it takes that setup to do the 1-2. Okay. Armor. Armor is one of the parts of gear in Daggerheart that changed the most across the beta to the final edition, right? If you played during the beta, the armor system was pretty different. I'm just going to be talking about the final version here. The key elements that armor has are base thresholds, which are damage thresholds, and then the base armor score. Your thresholds and your armor score can be modified by other things. Thresholds are always modified by your level, so you always add your character's level to each of your damage thresholds. And then your armor score is modified by a smaller number of things, but not 0 things. At tier 1, the way armor works is that the higher your thresholds and your armor score, the bigger your penalty to evasion and possibly agility. So a Gambeson armor has the lowest base thresholds and the lower base armor score of 3, but you get a bonus to evasion. And then when you can trade that bonus to evasion for higher thresholds, and that's your leather armor. If you want a higher armor score and higher thresholds from that, then your armor becomes heavy and you take a -1 penalty to evasion. And if you want even higher thresholds at that same armor score, then you're at full plate and you have a -2 to evasion and a -1 to your agility. So that spectrum of impact on evasion to thresholds and base score, for me, that's the kind of the spectrum to focus on for your armor design, and keep that in mind in the same way that the range to damage spectrum is something to keep in mind for weapons. So this is thresholds and armor score. Let's see. This tend to be inversely related with evasion modifier. That's probably the better way to say it, because thresholds and armor score are both impacted, right? That we have this kind of multi-stepped process. So if you're looking at making custom armor, one of the ways that you can try to benchmark it is you say, okay, what do I want the base score to be? And you look at other armor at that tier with that same base score, and you see what's the range of thresholds for armor of that type, and what kinds of features do weapons with that base, or do armor with that base score have? Do all the weapons with that base score at this tier have negative features? If so, and you want your armor to have that base armor score similar base thresholds and have a positive feature, you know that you're making something that's a little bit more out of step with the rest of the material in the tier. And again, you can do that with intentionality if you want. Or you can think, oh, well, most of the armor at this tier has a base score of 5 and the thresholds are over here, but I'm going to have the armor score be 5, but the thresholds be really low for armor with this number of armor with this armor score, and that's my downside so that I can have my really cool feature. The fact that you have base thresholds and you have the armor score gives you that ability to have there be some kind of contrast of like, oh, this is some kind of armor where it can be worn down over a long time. It has a higher armor score, but you're going to end up using that armor more often because the base thresholds are lower. Or you do the other way of like, oh, this has high base thresholds, but there's not many armor. The armor score is lower, so it deteriorates faster instead of being able to protect you in notable moments against a larger number of hits, right? You can move these levers up and down. And then the feature lever is kind of an intersecting one that you can apply in one way or another. Another drink real quick, pardon me. Okay, so that's some basic overview. I'm going to talk a little bit about loot and gear, and then we're going to go back and do some building. So looking at loot and gear, we have 4 tiers of rarity in the core book, or in the SRD and the core book: common, uncommon, rare, and legendary. And they give you dice pools that represent getting loot of that relative rarity. Because this is a core book designed largely agnostic or separate from a setting, you can muck with a lot of this. But the thing to take away from the chart is that generally the stuff that's at the lower numbers is going to be more common or potentially less powerful, and the stuff that's at the high end of the chart with the higher numbers is more likely to be more powerful or have a more rare specific application. And then that same relative rarity structure applies in consumables as well. So going back, let's try and make some cool weapons and talk about the process that we're going to use. So I do a lot of tier 2 stuff. So let's instead do some tier 3 weapons. Okay, so some of the cool magic stuff, the special items under physical weapons at tier 3 include the Meridian Cutlass. We've got the retractable saber, right, where the blade can be hidden to avoid detection. We've got a double flail for tier 3 magic weapons. Tier 3 magic weapons come first. They did. We have the Hammer of Exoda, which has this eruption feature. So that's pretty cool. So here's what I'm going to do. Let's try to come up with... this is a tier 3 primary magic primary weapon. It's the Lightning Lash. And the fantasy, again, right, I'm starting with the fiction. The fantasy I want from this is this idea that you have basically a whip that's kind of made of lightning, and then maybe the whip itself can kind of act like chain lightning. And so, right, we have the name. This is going to be a finesse weapon, right, because you need a lot of really specific control to use it. And it's going to have a range of very close. And then I'm looking at the damage pools, right? A lot of these are far weapons. I'm going to go down to the physical weapons, which tend, right? The magic weapons tend to have more ranged options because they're including things like staves and wands and stuff. It's not always the case. There's just a little bit of a tendency I see. So a very close weapon at tier 3 is the double flail, which is a d10 plus 8 and powerful. So I think this could be double flail. If I have this be d8 plus 6, that's definitely on the lower end. It's about the same as an advanced dagger, right, which is a d8 plus 7, but that's a one-handed weapon. And the lightning lash, should the lightning lash be a two-handed weapon? Maybe it's only a one-handed weapon, right? Maybe that's okay. And then the feature, we'll maybe name the feature later, right? When you, on a successful attack, the target marks a stress, and you can spend a hope to force another target within very close of the first to also mark a stress, right? And so what this means is that you're whipping the lightning lash around, you hit somebody, it taxes and stresses them, right? Because they're getting zapped with electricity. And then that electricity arcs over to another target within very close of the first one. And then they have to mark a stress. And you don't have to make an attack against that second one, right? And so maybe I call this feature Arc Lightning. And so that means that this is a finesse, very close weapon that deals d8 plus 6 magic damage and is one-handed. And then the feature is Arc Lightning. On a successful attack, the target marks a stress, and you can spend a hope to force another target within very close to the first to also mark a stress. Notably here, the way that this is written, on a successful attack, the target marks a stress. That part's free. If you additionally spend a hope, when you succeed, you can force another target to have to mark a stress. So this has the upside of the flexibility, and you are not forced to spend a hope every time you succeed on an attack, which would be, maybe you could do that for something, right? That you're using hope as fuel. And so instead of spending hope to utilize an experience, you're using it to like power the magic of the thing. Well, we could make that happen. Here we have that choice. So it is a bit like the one of the other features that says when you succeed on an attack, the target has to mark a stress, which is called Scary, right? The Devouring Dagger at tier 2 has this feature, right? Scary. On a successful attack, the target must mark a stress. The Lightning Lash effectively has that, but it has this other element as well. And so that's why we're giving it another name. If you build a weapon or armor or anything that has the exact same feature as something in core, it may just make sense to use that name because some people will already recognize it. If you want to change it because of flavor, I'm certainly not going to stop you, right? It may be a little bit more overhead, but if you're doing something that is subtly different or close but not quite to an existing feature, I definitely would not recommend giving it the exact same name. When I was doing some adversary design, I gave some adversaries the terrifying feature, but I misremembered the range and said that all PCs within close would lose a hope. Terrifying in the SRD says all PCs within far. And so I had used the same name, but written the feature differently. And I don't want to do that. And I do not recommend doing that. If I had wanted to keep that part that was close, and I did consider it for a little while, I thought, oh, okay, well, if this is terrifying, then would I call this feature frightening, right? And then I would, if I were going to do that, I would search the SRD for, is frightening used as the name of a feature? So I'm not then like duplicating something else. Okay, in the SRD, it doesn't look like that word is used for a feature. Now, if I'm misspelling it, then bummer for me. But that's why we have copy editors and editors, and we do our proofing passes and everything like that. So we have our arc lightning, lightning lash. Let's do a cool, really more like sorcerer magic-y weapon, right? So this is still gonna be tier 3. So at tier 3 we have Ego Blade, Casting Sword, Devouring Dagger, Hammer of Exoda, Utari Bloodbow, Elder Bow, Scepter of Elias, Wand of Enthrallment, Keeper's Staff. Let's come up with a scary like hand-to-hand melee weapon for this tier, right? Like gauntlets or something, right? So is Electrum a D&D thing? Why don't we call it Adamantine Knuckles, right? And so the idea is that this is brass knuckles, but they're like cool and super magic, right? And so that's they're also tier 3 magic primary weapons. So these are going to be strength, melee. And then I'm going to look at my strength melee weapons at this tier. Casting sword is D10 plus 4. Improved arcane gauntlets is D10 plus 6. So if I want to give these a feature, I'm probably looking at D10 plus 4 plus or minus, and we're going to call this magic damage as well. In core, I believe the physical weapons only ever do physical damage, and the magic weapons only ever do magic damage. So there's probably the Ghost Blade, I think you can pick which one you want to do. The magic weapons you need a spellcast trait for, rules as written. Could you break from that? Yes, I think so. Just try to be clear when you do it, whether you're asking a character to have a spellcast trait to use it or not. So these adamantine knuckles, Hammer Exoda does a knockback, but it's a AoE knockback. So what if these adamantine knuckles are just all right, I'm gonna have to come up with a term for how, like, fictionally why they do this knockback. But let's say on a successful attack, targets are knocked back to a close range, right? So this is magic brass knuckles, where if you hit somebody, you knock them back, 20 something feet, right? And so it's cool for like a brawler character or a character who's kind of up in the mix, to like clear things out. Brawler is not out yet, right? It's in the void, and brawler is not in the SRD. So if I wanted to design something specifically for a brawler, I would be either doing that in an anticipatory fashion, and I'd be a little on shaky ground with the CGL, or the thing to do is wait until Hope and Fear comes out and see if Darrington decides to add that character or anything about brawlers to the SRD or to public game content, and then make your decision there. I don't need to have the brawler in mind or reference the brawler for this weapon, even though I'm thinking of a brawler type character here, right? Darrington certainly doesn't own the idea of a brawler type character, right? That's just not how this works. So I'm reflecting on whether I'm on fine ground with the CGL. I feel totally fine about that. So we go with this, and then I want to come up with a name for the feature that is this knockback that it does, right? I'm going to check for the word pummel. No, I think pummel is just going to show up in adversaries. Yeah. So this could be a pummeling weapon. On a successful attack, targets are knocked back to a close range. And so you can, wade into a group, or if you're fighting against like a bruiser adversary and that bruiser is doing a bunch of AoE and like moving your PCs around, you instead go up with the adamantine knuckles and you pummel them and you knock them away from your allies. Or you isolate a weaker enemy and you move around and then pummel them back toward your allies, right? In a more directly tactical or more wholly tactical game, something like a Draw Steel or D&D 5e or Pathfinder, an ability like this could be especially powerful and important. But when I've streamlined down to Daggerheart levels, a weapon that lets me move my enemies around, I think is still cool, is still useful. It has a specific flavor. It's not duplicating what the Hammer of Exoda does because it's a one-on-one knockback instead of an area knockback. And the fiction of it is still really clear to me. So I feel totally fine about taking that approach. And now we're going to do some armor. My character in the game that I play with my kind of friends that I've known for a long time has the Elundrian chain armor, and that has worked really well for her. But again, let's stick at tier 3. So at tier 3, we have Belamois fine armor, which is gilded and gives you a bonus to presence. The dragon scale armor, which is impenetrable. Once per long rest, when you would mark your last hit point, you can instead mark a stress. Spiked plate armor, which basically hurts people when they attack you. Blade fair armor, can't mark an armor slot against magic damage. The Monette's cloak can't mark an armor slot against physical. And then the runes of fortification, each time you mark an armor slot, you must mark a stress, right? Because it has damage thresholds that are higher than anything else at tier 3, and it has that high armor score of 6. So it's the highest in base thresholds and it's equal to the highest in base score, but then the feature is negative, much like the feature for Monette's cloak, and Balefire armor is also negative. At tier 3, advanced chain and advanced full plate have armor score of 6, so looking up and down tier 3, no armor at tier 3 has a base score of 6 and does not have a negative feature or a feature that has a negative element. So that's kind of giving us the bounds of what we want to, or what core thinks is appropriate. That's my interpretation here. So if we wanted some cool tier 3 armor, so let's say we want armor that's about like cover or shadows, right? And so this is Mantle of Starlight. No, Mantle of... I was saying Mantle of Midnight, but that's a little alliteration-y. All right, let's just go Mantle of Shadow so I don't get caught up on terms. This is going to be tier 3 armor. Base thresholds, armor, base armor score. If this is about hiding and shadow, it's probably going to have lower thresholds and base score, and then have a really cool feature. So I'm looking at thresholds here. The advanced leather armor thresholds for tier 3 are 1127. I think that's probably about right. And then a base score of 5. If I then give this armor a really cool feature, it's going to be just better than advanced leather armor. And maybe I'm okay with that. Let me scroll a bit for you. Thank you for the reminder, Sangre00. So if I go and look at other stuff, right? So the Bellamoth Fine Armor gives you, so the fact that the Bellamoth Fine Armor is just better than Advanced Leather Armor because it also gives you that bonus to presence. That tells me that I'm probably okay to give my Mantle of Shadow a cool feature, and it's not going to feel broken compared to tier 3 armor overall. It might be just better than Advanced Leather Armor, but that's probably okay. In a game where we're caring more about gear, there's probably that moment where, okay, well, I bought the tier 2 version of my armor because that was available, but then we get some treasure that's tier 2 armor that's like really special, right? And that kind of progression can be fun in your game. So let's say, so cloaked is already a term that's used by the rogue class. Right, so we want some kind of evocative feature name, right? Shadow Wreathed or whatever. Do not lose hidden when you move into sight of an adversary. So this would be like a cool weapon or a cool armor for somebody who wants to do roguey stuff but does not have that core rogue feature that gives them the cloaked ability, right? Because if we go and we look at the rogue class, anytime you would be hidden, you are instead cloaked. In addition to the benefits of the hidden condition, while cloaked, you remain unseen if you are stationary when an adversary moves to where they would normally see you. After you make an attack or at the end of a move within line of sight of an adversary, you are no longer cloaked, right? So by my interpretation, with cloaked, you could be hidden and therefore cloaked, move into line of sight with an enemy and attack them, and then you lose cloaked and therefore hidden at the end of that attack. That's how I've run it. So I can look at the cloaked feature and then decide how much of this language do I want to copy directly. Right, so here's most of that text. In addition to the benefits of the hidden condition, while cloaked, so I could say, you remain unseen if you are stationary when an adversary moves to where they would normally see you. So this would be, while hidden, you remain unseen. And then after you make an attack or end a move within line of sight of an adversary, you are no longer hidden. So that would be an item that's basically the same as the class feature. I probably want to do something that's a little bit different. So when you become hidden, you can spend a hope to become cloaked. So if I do it this way, by saying, hey, this is basically that class feature, but there's a cost for you. If I do that, I can then just take that that feature text and probably repeat it pretty directly because it's in the SRD, and that's fine to do. If I wanted it to work a little differently, I would decide what I want that language to be, and when I'm reflecting on it, I would say, is there a reason for me to use different wording when something exists in the game that does what I'm kind of thinking of in terms of the fiction? It already does it. Is the Mantle of Shadow just a way that people have enchanted items so that they can be as sneaky and dangerous as a rogue? Because what this doesn't do is it doesn't give you sneak attack, right? The other rogue class feature that says, hey, when you're cloaked or when you have this ally nearby, you get this bonus damage. Well, if a character doesn't have sneak attack, they don't have the 2 of the 1/2 that cloaked and sneak attack will give you. So it's already not as good even if what it does is basically parallel, because all these abilities exist in context and can synergize with one another. If I do that, I would have to go back to being cloaked here, right? Okay, so this is the version where this item basically lets you have that rogue class feature, but you don't get sneak attack, right? So who is this for, right? This is for maybe a bard character that wants to be sneaky, a sorcerer that wants to be sneaky because they have access to the midnight domain. It could be, right? So here's the thing I can do. I know the assassin is coming. I could build something within the SRD that could be useful to the assassin without referencing any of that text. The best time to do that is once the assassin is already out. So even if the assassin isn't in the SRD, you can kind of design with them in mind, because you're not actually breaking anything in the CGL as I see it. But there is a use case for this item just in SRD material. And if it then happens to also be cool for somebody else later on, I think that's a bonus. That's just my approach here. Again, the idea of a character who's like an assassin is not something that is limited only to Darrington Press in the Hope and Fear expansion, right? I might have a bard who's like an assassin, right? They're more like they're like a 007 infiltrator courtesan kind of a character. And so having this would be really handy for them, even if they don't have access to the sneak attack part. They're not an assassin character with a specific assassin class features or anything like that. For me, the places where I am going to want to do gear and item and weapon design are when something happens in the fiction. They're like, oh, this should have its own thing. In one of the Witherwild games that I ran, and we're just going to go to here because I'm kind of done with the screen, and I'm just going to talk a bit more and then we'll wrap up. I was running Voice of the Swarm. Here's a good chance for me to tie things in. Voice of the Swarm is my adventure for the Witherwild campaign frame to be used with the Daggerheart rules. And in that campaign frame, or in that adventure, I have Haven soldiers that have like fire staffs, right? They're like basically magic flamethrowers. And the player characters kind of defeated some of those soldiers and routed them. And I said, oh, well, one of them left their fire staff behind. And so then I created the stats for a fire staff. I think there's actually something in the SRD that I could have used, but I just designed something that evening, kind of purpose-built for what existed in the fiction, right? So I make items like that. As a reminder, you can get my over 7,000 word work in progress draft of Voice in the Swarm by being a paid member at my Patreon. So consider that. I did, per a comment request on that post, make a simple PDF version of the adventure that will hopefully be more usable, portable, or whatever than just reading the text post. So I make custom stuff based on what emerges in the fiction. I have made custom stuff for the Bastion of Hope campaign frame because having gear and items would help me express the fiction of that world, right? Express the vibe and the tone and like the kind of genre stuff. But I don't do a whole lot of other item and gear design. It's not where my attention flows most regularly. Therefore, this is a good exercise for me because there may be times when I'm asked to make more gear and items and things. But if you are curious about gear, item, armor, weapons, weapon design, and things like that, Again, I would point folks at the Many Worlds Tavern Patreon. Many Worlds they have a Patreon level that's just basically get the game stuff. I'm just going to try and find that. Okay, this is a page that's about subscription, so this should do. This is subscription bundles, and the one you would want to look for is Wayward Wonders, and that's the one that has like the game designy stuff in it. So that's for Daggerheart. It would be new domain cards, weapons, armor, other items, stuff like that. Junkrabbit asks, when writing a tier 1 adventure, would you seed mostly tier 2 items throughout, since tier 1 is only a level long? That's a great question. I think that your instinct is a pretty solid one. If I was writing an adventure, especially that maybe covered levels 1 to 3, right? By the end of the adventure, you go up to level 3, having already gone up to level 2. Seeding in tier 2 items would be really handy. I think awarding characters tier 1 gear during a tier 1 adventure is probably going to be less useful. And I'm coming to be kind of more of the mindset that a story arc for tier 1 can be shorter, because it's just this one level. The power spike from level 1 to level 2 is pretty big, so you might want that first story arc to be a little bit longer if you have people who have not played Daggerheart before at all, or if you feel like the group has said, we want to just kind of get into this game slowly and not get overwhelmed. But otherwise, yeah, I think keeping tier 2 in mind right away is a pretty solid approach. And it means that you're not going to have to design stuff at tier 1 and then scale it up for tier 2. As I move forward in design, I am thinking of maybe having my second and later adversary books not be as bottom heavy, where Menagerie of Mayhem #1 has, I think, the most tier 1 adversaries, slightly fewer tier 2, fewer tier 3, fewer tier 4. I might end up with, for example, but don't quote me on this, 8 adversaries at tier 1, 12 at tier 2, 8 or 10 at tier 3, and then 4 to 6 at tier 4, because there's already a lot of tier 1 adversaries in the core book. Depending on other books and things that you have, right, there may be a lot of other ones. I don't know the adversary spread in Hope and Fear, right? That hasn't been announced. But I think if you're designing adversaries and you would rather focus on tier 2 and above, I think there's a pretty good argument for doing that due to how well supported tier 1 already is. The fact that you can take tier 1 adversaries and tier them up. You can't take tier 2 adversaries and tier them down, right? There's guidance in the core book and then in the homebrew kit. But the way that I have run RPGs, I just don't think in terms of loot very much. So it's one of the things that I actually have to do more consciously, because over the years, I played 5e a lot more than I ran it. And it's been a while since I ran a RPG that was really loot and gear oriented. Junkrabbit says, one thing I've noticed little guidance on is balancing different tiers in a single encounter. Yeah, I think that's a fair shout. My answer to, or the way that I think about that, is that I mostly don't use mismatched tier elements in an encounter. If my group is tier 2, I'm mostly going to use tier 2 adversaries, and they're going to be getting tier 2 gear. If I'm using something from a different tier, I might use some tier 1 adversaries in a tier 2 fight to round out the numbers, or as a lesser threat, kind of a summon. right? There's the cult ritual environment can introduce a minor demon. A minor demon is a tier 1 adversary. If you scaled up the cult ritual to tier 2, you might still have them summon a tier 1 minor demon. Just know that that's going to be a proportionately lower threat, especially if your tier 2 characters have tier 2 weapons and tier 2 armor, right? So the damage that they deal and the damage they can take is on par with tier 2 stuff. Theoretically, the most dangerous time for characters is at that first level of a new tier when they may not have necessarily gotten access to tier 2 gear of all these types. Their damage output might not be as high as it would be with tier 2 gear. Their toughness won't be as high because they're only adding their level of 2 to their base thresholds, and they might be adding that to the base thresholds number of tier 1 armor. You can keep that in mind in terms of when you want to award gear, right? Do you want your characters to have more survivability, and so therefore you give them the armor of their new tier earlier in that tier, and you give them the weapons a little bit later on so that they have to feel like they're going uphill a little bit in hurting the adversaries, but they're not as likely to be having to make a bunch of death moves because their armor has caught up to the damage output of adversaries. Or you flip it around and you say, yeah, you're going to get better weapons, but you're going to be more fragile until you get access to that higher tier armor. And those can give you different kinds of experiences. Yeah, right. So the cult ritual is, by its existing structure, introducing a lower tier enemy, but the minor demon is an incredibly powerful tier 1 adversary, right? If we look at their fear, the fear move they do that like does a big AoE, that's really nasty. But yeah, there's adversaries that will summon other adversaries, but that are of a lower tier, and environments where you might experience that. I don't tend to hold really strictly to the battle points system, even though I think it's very useful in a lot of cases. The battle points system does not have explicit, actually it does have explicit guidance if you're using adversaries. I didn't design the battle point system, so I don't have it as memorized. Just going to go find it. Right, you add a point to your budget if you choose an adversary from a lower tier, right? So if I have a tier 2 characters and I use a tier 1 adversary, I get a point of my battle point budget back because I'm using a lower tier adversary. So there's a little bit of guidance there. In general, because so much of my GMing experience is in more kind of narrative focused and often rules light games, and that's light compared to 5e Pathfinder, and then sometimes even compared to Daggerheart, which for me is a little bit less crunchy than 5e or Pathfinder, but we can argue about crunch. I'd rather not do so. With the games that I play, my combat prep or design, I'm usually trying to focus it on specific narrative factors, right? I want to challenge the characters because of this. The objective in the scene is that, more so than here is a big, scary arena fight. But that's just my personal preference. Because of that, I tend to attend a little bit less closely to focus and the specific numbers, and am very comfortable adjusting things in the moment. But that's just my personal style. It means that sometimes when I'm designing, I have to think a little more actively outside of my own frame of reference. So we've done the shout out to Voice of the Swarm. I want to remind folks, if you have not already seen, a few weeks ago I did a crowdfunding roundup of not just Daggerheart, but some Daggerheart related projects And one of the things that I talked about was Hope Springs Eternal, which is a supplement with new campaign frames and corresponding locations, edited and published by Eric. Eric, I think you told me how to pronounce your name and then I forgot. I'm sorry. Last name is Lazure. And Eric has a couple of writers working on this project, including somebody that I know from a Discord. And this project is about coming up on somewhere around 2/3 funded, about a day and a half in. So funding looks very likely, and then they've got some stretch goals in mind. If you are looking for Daggerheart stuff specifically, you want examples of how campaign frame can really push Daggerheart towards specific tones or genres, you might want to take a look at Hope Springs Eternal because of the choices that that team has made. So I think that's going to be that. I'm going to pull up a Twitch page to see if there's anybody to go raid. Ding, 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 ding. Okay. Let's check. Let's check just under Daggerheart. Okay. Nobody that I know, so we're going to hold off on that. Thank you very much to everybody for hanging out and watching. Thank you to the folks who are here live. Thanks to the folks who watch the VOD later, and whether that's here or on YouTube. If you have questions about this or other Daggerheart stuff, you can ask questions on the YouTube videos in comments, or you can go to my Patreon and try to find a related post, or just ask a question on a recent post, and I will try to get to it when I can. Thank you to Junkrabbit, to Pathfinder PhD, Sangre00, and everybody else who is here live. And then thanks as well to folks who are watching some other way, some other time. I will probably stream again next week, but as we get into December, things will get more busy. I will make a post on Patreon, and if I don't stream then, I will stream probably one of the last days of the year with my Stuff of the Year stream, or the SODIes, which are a year in review that sort of takes the form of an award show because it's fun. So that's all that. Thanks for hanging out, and I will see you next time. Where's my ending thing? It's here. Bye.